Shall we do? Let's do De Palma, actually, because I want to do De Palma first. So De Palma is a documentary about, guess who?
Is it Joe Meek?
No, it's
Brian
not.
De Palma.
About Brian De Palma by Noah Baumbach and Jake Paltrow. And Brian De Palma is one of those filmmakers who has often divided opinions. That on the one hand, people think of him as being technically brilliant, that he has orchestrated extraordinary shots, which advance narrative, but also, are very visually stylish. And then there's the other argument about him, which is that he's, his films have repeatedly come back to the idea of violence against women, and they are sleazy and exploitational, and that he's been accused of being a misogynist, and this is a subject that returns throughout Brian De Palma's career. So in this documentary, rather than having a bunch of talking heads talking about Brian De Palma and the ups and downs of his career, what they have is a talking head, which is basically Brian De Palma talking his way through his career. And in sort of very well orchestrated fashion, De Palma, who is interviewed, talks us through his entire, from Murder a la Mode and Greetings and Hi Mom and early works with Robert De Niro when he was being sort of, starting out experimental filmmaker, through The Breakthrough, Sisters, and of course, covered in some detail. You were just saying Stephen King's short stories are often his best stuff. Well, actually, one of Stephen King's shorter novels is Carrie, which Brian De Palma famously brought to the screen with Sissy Spacek. Talks about it in the film. Here's a clip.
Carrie came to me in the steam room over on 12th Street, where a writer friend of mine suggested this book by Stephen King called Carrie. I discovered it was at United Artists. Mike Madavoy was head of the studio. He knew who I was and liked my movies, and that's how I got the job. We kept on coming in with a budget of $1.8 million, and they said, we're not making it $1.8 million. It's got to be $1.6 million. And I said, just like my Get to Know Your Rabbit experience, I said, guys, that's what it costs. It's $1.8 million. And they said, fine. And then they started moving the furniture out of my office. The movie had been canceled. So I went home that weekend and thought about it, and I somehow came back and said, what, I've been thinking about it. If we move this and change this around, maybe we can do it for $1.6 million. And they said, great, it's a go. And of course, it cost $1.8 million.
But I love that way of negotiating.
Yeah,
but that great.
But also, what's brilliant about it is the delivery, the way in which he delivers that with this kind of completely deadpan with the thing and the punchline at the end. And of course, it cost $1.8 million. And De Palma, I've interviewed Brian De Palma a couple of times. I know a couple of people who've had quite difficult interview experiences with Brian De Palma. I know a couple of people who've had sort of pretty terrific interview experiences with him. Mine was that I went to New York to interview him for a program that I was doing for Radio 2, and I was literally on the ground in New York in something like 3 hours. And we had a very, very sort of short period of time with him. And at first he was quite good, because I think because he's had so much flack during his career with critics in particular accusing him of, misogyny and chauvinism, that sort of thing, that he tends to be fairly suspicious of critics. And he's also somebody who has discovered that with Pauline Kael aside, he's somebody who's not really been a critic's darling. So he started off being sort of very chippy and very suspicious. And then as we got into about the 20th minute of the interview, we realised that I actually was quite a fan of his films. And then he started to cheer up. But then, of course, we only had about 5 minutes left, which was, and you've had the same experience where you think, if only you could have been that much fun 20 minutes ago, because actually in the case of this, he's that much fun for the whole duration of the film. And it's often the case that if you were making a documentary about a filmmaker, the thing you don't immediately think about is, how much fun this is going to be. But De Palma is really good fun. And it's partly because the story of his career involves enough movies that everybody kind of knows, that you're always so around he said, How to Train Your Rabbit, which is something that people wouldn't necessarily know about, but everybody knows Dressed to Kill, everybody knows Untouchables, everybody knows Scarface. Then later on, it goes, as I said, it literally goes through the whole career. So we get Raising Cain, we get Femme Fatale, which didn't even open theatrically here, opened, I think, straight to DVD. So it's pretty thorough. We get movies like Phantom of the Paradise. Did you ever see Phantom of the Paradise?
No.
Okay, so Phantom of the Paradise, which he's very keen to point out, came out before Rocky Horror, because Phantom of the Paradise is 74, Rocky Horror Picture Show is 75, although, of course, Rocky Horror Show, as you know, is 1973. So the question of exactly whether it predates it or not is not particular. But it's this kind of really weird, strange, cult classic movie. I mean, you wouldn't know what it meant if I went Phoenix. No, okay, fine. But okay, so Phantom of the Paradise is a film that you should see because you'd really enjoy it. It's sort of Phantom of the Opera, but done with a kind of, rock and roll edge, and it's, strange and outre. The film obviously begins, and indeed...
How does that catchphrase go again, which I wouldn't get?
Which one?
The one you just did?
Phoenix.
Right, okay.
That actually turns up on a record. I think it's a Polecat record. Maybe it's a Tim Polecat record.
I won't have heard it.
Just a sample of that. Okay, fine. It starts and ends with Hitchcock and with De Palma talking about, watching things like Vertigo and Clips from North by Northwest and talking about his profound response to those films. And then going on to talk about the fact that De Palma has been called throughout his career a Hitchcock imitator. And what he says is, I'm the only, he said, people always talk about this for Hitchcock. He says, I'm the only person who is doing that Hitchcock thing. I'm the only person who is following on, is looking at that as a template of a way to work and a way to tell films visually. And when it comes to anything ideological, like when they're talking about Body Double, which he got into an awful lot of trouble for, and there's this question about why is the drill bit the size the drill bit is, and this is this was a big ideological question. He says, well, it's because it had to go through the floor, and it just made complete sense to me. Anyway, the thing I'm really interested in is the way the camera pans around this, and actually just looking at the clips and looking at the way in which you are struck by the artistry of what he has done, even when it's frustrating that he just so completely and utterly refuses to engage himself in an ideological discussion about what the films may or may not mean.
Does he answer the critics effectively?
Yeah, his answer to the critics is, look, I'm making, this is the genre of film that I'm making, and and this is how I see the world, and he's got that weird thing about saying this makes sense to me. And I don't agree. I mean, I think there are great problems with De Palma's back catalogue. I think there are always things in it that are interesting. I think there are always things in it that are frustrating. And there also seem to be things in it, particularly in the case of Body Double, incidentally, in which he appeared to be very specifically thumbing his nose at his ideological critics. But rather than doing the thing which they could have done, which is to get a whole bunch of voices in a room to argue the pros and cons of it, what they've done is they've just gone, Brian, the floor is yours.
So it's like one long selfie, basically. He's just talking to the camera. Putting the record straight.
Yeah, but it doesn't. Yes, but it's much more fun than that, and it's not just one selfie because it's not just him talking to the camera because there's all these clips, there's all this stuff. And actually, what I was trying to say was, when you look at the body of those things, when you look at him talking about the final shot of Carrie, when you look at him talking about the escalator scene from Carlito's Way, when you look about him talking about the Odessa step sequence from The Untouchables, when you look at him talking about even about Femme Fatale, which I said was. You go, okay, yeah, there's a scene very early on in which he's talking about orchestrating a scene with three people talking, and he's making the film with somebody else, and they've just got a static shot and they don't understand it. He says, no, you can't do that. You have to do the shot like this. And you go, yeah, you understand cinema. You've got completely weird ideological problems sometimes, but you do understand cinema.